What is going on, everybody, and welcome back into Byerly Studios. I'm so glad to have you here for another project. Now, this is going to be a Winnie the Pooh honey jar. It's going to have a lot of different variations, and of course, you know that I like to be a little bit extra, so I'm going to take it to the next level. And we're going to do just a bunch of different techniques on this tumbler that I've been wanting to try for a while, and it's just going to be a really fun process overall. The sculpting portion of this is just pretty simple, but the painting portion is where it's going to really come alive because I do want it to have like an enameled look to it. I want it to look as if it was really fired in a kiln and then came out with an enameled glossy look. So I'm going to begin this process by using my clay extruder, and I'm going to apply rings of clay to it, just very thin lines, all the way down the length of the tumbler. Now this is a 20-ounce modern curve tumbler. And you'll see as I work this down, it's just going to give it a nice overall textured feel all the way down the tumbler. So sit back and enjoy this time lapse as I work my way down. So as we get down to the bottom of the tumbler here, you can see I'm kind of gapping those last few lines there. We did get off on the lines a little bit just because clay's different pressures is going to change the way it's shaped and things like that. So I'm going to have to fix that later, which is no problem at all. I'm also going to remove two lines from the top. I decided to put a banded ring around the top and the bottom, and I'm thinking I'm going to paint that in maybe a bronze or a gold metallic. That way it can kind of frame in or just add some ornateness to the existing jar instead of it just being all like a porcelain or a enamel look all the way down. So I'm gonna apply a thicker ring of clay here, same extruder, just a larger gauge. I'm gonna blend that in. It doesn't have to be perfect, guys. Remember this is gonna be kind of cartoonish, but at the same time I'm trying to bring in some realistic elements to it. I'm going to do the same thing around the bottom. So I'm actually going to change out the extruder and I'm going to go back to a slightly smaller gauge than the one above. And you can see here I actually had to come back and add a little bit more clay there because I ran out. I just didn't extrude enough of a line to go all the way around the tumbler. No worries there. Kind of cutting away some of that meat, make it as smooth as possible. All right, so that's looking pretty good. I like the overall feel of that. I like how thick the bands are around the top and the bottom, and I think they look pretty uniform. So now I'm going to add the same gauge I used before for the main portion of the texture of the tumbler. And I'm going to work that all the way around above and below the bands. And I'm going to blend that in so that it actually looks like a textured band with multiple layers. And it looks like it's almost strapped around the actual jar itself. And that will give me one more to paint, and it also will look like it's blended in instead of it just being one piece of clay all the way around. It just will feel out of place if I were to leave that and paint it as it was. we're going to do the same thing around the top. The same double step variation, and I'm going to blend that into that top band all the way around. Of course, I'm going to kind of jump time here, and that's all squared away there. Now I'm going to blend in the bottom rim there, and I come back later and I add clay to the very bottom of the cup in a textured format. I just left that till last in case I wanted to set it up vertical at some point. So I'm just smoothing it with my finger. It doesn't have to be extremely smooth. I just want it to be, overall just okay. Alright, so now for the very top, I didn't want to leave that just open right there. I didn't want that to be weak, so I do go ahead and add a small gauge of extruded clay in that seam between the top rim and that band. I will probably paint that the same color as the band, and then I may just shade the very, very fine inside line of the stainless steel before I kind of clean up that rim before epoxying. It's going to have a drip as well, so some of that will be covered up quite a bit, but I'm still going to apply that detail work, so that way when it's all said and done, if something's peeking through somewhere, then it's kind of covered up. I don't want it missing something and then just be like, oh well, I can't go back and fix that because it's got epoxy on it. And one little thing at that point will leave a bad taste in the mouth for the entire project. So we're going to do the smooth that out there all the way around. And then we're going to go ahead and put it back on the turner, which I'm using just as a way to hold the tumbler in place. Looking pretty good. I like how that seam looks around the top of the tumbler. Alright, so I'm really liking how the bands are looking right now. I'm just trying to get them as blocked in, as perfect as I can. I'm going to come in here in a minute and I'm going to smooth those out quite a bit. So I'm just using the tumbler turner and rotating it a little bit at a time, and using the silicone tip tool to just smooth that out. I'm going to blend this a little bit more around the top. And look at the texture, guys. This thing is fabulous. I've been wanting to try this texture on a lot of different tumblers, and I plan to use this a lot in the future to make different things. But the overall jar effect or look to it looks amazing. All right, so we're going to jump in now to creating the honey logo or emblem that we go on the front of the jar for most of the Winnie the Pooh jars. This isn't really necessarily, it doesn't have to be Winnie the Pooh, it could just be a honey jar, right? But it's still very cool. So I'm using rubbing alcohol here, and I'm going over it with a brush, and I'm removing all my fingerprints, and I'm also using that to smooth the top layer of the clay. So it loosens up the clay and it smooths it out. Now I had planned to do that on the middle of the tumbler as well, but I didn't have to do that very much. And here you can see how wet it is. I'm really applying a lot of that alcohol. I'm not afraid to, lay it on there thick and just let it drip off. It's not going to hurt anything. It's just going to smooth it out really good. And it also makes it kind of look like it's one piece of clay all the way around. And when the paint is applied to that, it's just going to be next level. It's going to be incredible. I go over the center a little bit with that, but I just didn't feel the need to do it a whole lot, guys. I want to keep that rippled texture through the entire build, even if some of it is removed during the painting and the epoxy process, but I still wanted to do that. Smooth everything out. Now, I cut these little stencils out with the Cricut, and I thought this was going to be an easier process than it turned out to be. Not that it was difficult or anything, it's just the way that I originally tried to make this little emblem with honey on the front. It was just kind of messy and it was too blocky, it just didn't work out. So I show a little bit of that here just so I can show my mistakes. I'm not afraid to admit that I make mistakes, right? So I also cut a piece of aluminum foil here, and I'm wanting to use that as the backing for the clay itself, between the clay and the stencil, or the plastic stencil. So I'll cut this out with an X-Acto knife here. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be amazingly great. It's just so that I can get something behind the clay and I can work with it more. So I'm laying that on the parchment paper and on the plastic stencil, and I'm going to go ahead and smooth out my clay. Now, I began this process with way too thick of clay. It was way too blocky. You'll kind of see me kind of fitting it onto the front of the jar there. I used the X-Acto knife to cut around the plastic stencil that I made at an angle. Kind of gives me that oval shape. And you'll see me having to shave down the clay over and over again because it just was not thin enough. It was way too blocky. I could have cut away some of the ribbed texture and then it would have inset into the actual clay itself, which would have just decreased the overall depth itself without me having to shave this down so smooth and so shallow there. So you'll see me kind of work through this process. I also use the actual wording honey stencil itself also. The first time that I did this, I pressed the honey stencil into the clay and then I just hand removed the overall shape of the wording. It worked. It was okay. And I think it would have been okay if I had painted it that way too, because the painting can be, the shading of the painting can kind of change the way that the actual item looks, not just from the texture. So here you can see me pressing it in, and it was just too kind of blocky, too ugly. So I'm showing it because I made a mistake, guys. But I do not keep the way that this looks. So you can see I scraped away it with just the tool and not the stencil itself. So the wording and the spacing of the wording isn't exact, and it bothered me. So I tried to smooth this out with some rubbing alcohol, the same that I did for the actual banding on the tumbler itself. So I try this, and then you'll see I'll come back here in a minute and I'll do it a different way, and it works out much better. So there it is in all its glory. I wasn't feeling it, guys. So instead I smoothed it out again, took off a little bit more meat because it was still too deep. And this time I actually scraped the clay through the stencil itself. It gives me more control. It's not really the way that I'd like to do it. I'd like to freehand it, but it just didn't work out that way. So as I take that material away, you can see it's just the lines in the wording are smoother, they're thinner, and they're the way they need to be. So when I come in with maybe a Mars Black and a uh, burnt umber wash, perhaps, to darken the wording, while as the other portion of this oval will be maybe an off-white, maybe a Naples white or something, then it's just going to look really good. It's going to pop the way it needs to, and it's going to look like it's carved into pottery clay. So I'm removing the plastic backing, and then that's when I start to fit it in. I use a piece of parchment paper to smooth it out, and I'm trying to press that into and onto the existing clay without leaving too much fingerprints or taking away from too much of the shape. I use some rubbing alcohol on the interiors of the wording just to smooth it out. And it still looks a little bit messy, but I do kind of clean up the edges and tidy them up a little bit. Remember, this is supposed to look like cartoon clay in a way, and it's not perfect. And it doesn't have to be perfect. So the overall jar is, I want it to look like a pottery jar. I want it to look like it maybe came out of his house. And how many honey jars do you think Winnie the Pooh had laying around his house? He had honey jars everywhere. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It could have been laying up against other jars or up against a wall. Could have been scratched. Could have been used. Like I said, this isn't a trophy. It's a honey jar. So it's something that you would use to hold that yummy golden honey in. So just smoothing it out a little bit over time, just kind of getting the general shape overall. I'm going to paint it, which will just kind of take away any kind of imperfections as I get to that process. So it just looks kind of messy. Trust the process. It'll get there. Then I'm going to hit it with a light layer of rubbing alcohol just to smooth out the edges there. And you can kind of see around the oval, the bottom of the oval, that's not a perfect oval, and I don't want it to be. I don't want it to be, I don't want it to look like something's manufactured. I want it to look like a real honey jar that perhaps would have been in somebody's cottage. And then you'll see me just detail work this just a little bit more, smoothing out the edges just a tiny bit before I move into the next process. But you can really see that the overall shape of the tumbler is really coming along. It's really starting to take shape and look like a honey jar. All right, so now I'm going to use liquid clay or bacon bond. A lot of people call it different things, but basically it's just liquid clay. And I'm using a brush to brush the bacon bond in on particular areas. One, it is going to fill in any kind of small cracks or void. It's going to add a little bit of strength to that texture that I laid around the tumbler. And it's just going to add some smoothness to particular areas so that it's not absolutely perfect or the same all the way down. And when I translate the paint onto the item, some of the paint will seep in between the ribs and some of it will lay on top of it. So you'll kind of see that. It's hard to see on camera, I know, but I am using just the clay, the liquid clay, to kind of fill in grooves here and there, applying just a smooth texture to it where I need it to be. All right, this thing is looking absolutely incredible. At this point, it is looking amazing. Now, I will probably come back later on down the road, and I'll probably do this again for myself or maybe a family member, and I may make a honey pot topper to go on here as well. So I'll probably do that later. So I made an assortment of honeycomb and bees and flowers from some silicone molds, and I used different textures because I didn't know which way I wanted to go with this. So I do know that I wanted to have some honeycomb coming from the top of the tumbler, kind of hanging down over the pottery. Not a whole lot, just enough to give it some variation and just give it some just cool textures. Now these are a flat profiled bee. I got the molds in a kit from Amazon and I wanted to try them all out just because, right? Just because. So I actually want to maybe make a small rope that could go around the top of the tumbler and it could have these kind of hanging from it, kind of like beads, and maybe like a little bell or something. I don't know about that. I might tinker with it and see how I feel about that. So I'll set that off to the side and then we'll kind of look at the rest of them here. Now I did the honeycomb texture out of like two different mediums. I did a UV resin and then I also did a acrylic paint and epoxy pour into the mold. And I think that I like the acrylic paint one more. It's more forgiving. You can bend it after it's fully cured because you added the paint to it, but the UV resin is not forgiving at all. So you could technically bend the silicone mold around the tumbler shape and then cure it with the UV light, and it would maybe give you the correct shape overall, and then you could put it in place. I like the idea of being able to slightly bend the acrylic paint and the epoxy method uh, after the fact, and I can bend it however I need to. And it's pretty forgiving. I don't have to worry about it snapping as I curvature that around the tumbler itself. And then here I am just trying to see how I kind of want those to fit together like a puzzle piece. And I might have a small piece that comes off to the side so that way there's just not two uniform pieces. Kind of breaks that up a little bit. But I'm still experimenting with that idea. So we'll see how that goes in part two of this series. So I also made some flowers. I've used flower molds before with clay, and they're always perfect. But this time, because they were so detailed, I used resin, and I had trouble getting the air bubbles out of the flowers. I don't really plan to use flowers for this build, I don't think. If I do, then I might, cover that in the next series as I kind of work out the last few details of the build. But there were too many air pockets and air bubbles in the overall design of these silicone molds, which made them very difficult to use. Even after I kind of pushed the resin around to get those bubbles out, they were still there. This is the first one I did. I did this with a UV resin, and it's pretty cool. I had a little bit of over pour there, so that it has a lot of strength on those little legs. Same thing here, air bubbles, testing those out. I had a problem with the wings on these. So I had used a little small spike tool to remove the air bubbles from the wings. I thought I had, and it still left little air bubbles at the very tips of the wings. So I may have to tinker with this, and as far as just pouring into just the wings, let it set for a few minutes, and then pour the rest of the body. I don't want those little chips in the wings. I just don't want that. I do like both the Naples yellow as well as the bronze for the tone of the bees. I don't mind either one of them. I think they'd look good once they're painted because I do plan to detail hand paint those. So here I am. I'm just going to trim up these the one that I already made here. I'm just going to kind of cut away the excess. This is going to have an epoxy pour around it. And I'm going to make that as realistic as possible to the overall color of real honey. So I'm going to do some tests to get that as perfect as possible, just because it's something that I've never had to do before, and it's something new. It's kind of fun. And you may ask yourself, well, Mr. Byerly, why did you do all the resin work before you actually finished the baking of the tumbler? And this is why. I wanted to remove a part of the top of the jar, and I wanted to make it look like that it was broken away and that the honey and all of the goodness is running away and down the tumbler. I'm not going to have an overture of honey dripping out of it, but with the honeycomb coming out, it being a realistic tone jar as far as color, it's going to have the honeycomb coming out of it, and then it's going to have the honey drip coming out of there as well. And I think that's just going to give it a realistic look, and I think it's going to look really cool when it all comes together if I can get the shades and the colors correct. So I'm just kind of removing some of the excess around those bees that I've already created. I'm going to make more bees over the next few days for this, so that way I have an excess of them. And if I mess up the painting on any of them, then I can just choose the best ones. Now we're going to immediately jump into going ahead and adding the clay to the very bottom of the tumbler. I also wanted this to be a texture feature, so it is also going to have just a thin layer of clay, and then I'm going to texture this, which is also something that I've never done before. So I'm going to use the turner itself to just apply a spiral pattern up and into the center of the tumbler base. So you'll see me do this with some clay removal tools. It's just going to be really cool. I've been wanting to try this technique for a while, and it actually works out pretty good. Not as smooth as I'd like for it to be, but I think if I continue to do it this way, I'd get better and better at it. So sit back and enjoy this time lapse as I work through this process. It probably took me overall about an hour to complete this portion of the build, and it's just a really satisfying thing to do. Of course, it's going to have a lot more epoxy in there than usual, but it's going to have a overall flat base because I did sit it vertical multiple times to make sure that it was flat, and it sits flat. And then we'll come in with some epoxy and some washes and everything. It's going to look really incredible. Really fun process to try this out with. So as you can see here, I'm using a toothbrush and not alcohol ink, but water just to remove any excessive clay that's been removed during the process. And once I have it smoothed out and all the clay removed, then I'll come in and I'll continuously work this until I get the overall spiral shape that I want. Like I said, it's not a rib texture, it's just a fun spiral texture that you may possibly get on a clay pottery turner. I don't know, but it's just a fun thing that gives it some definition on the bottom instead of just a flat or smooth or boring bottom. It's going to have a cute butt. Now, what an incredible build this thing has turned out to be. Just up to this point, it's just clay and a little bit of resin work. It is an incredible build to see that it's came from a 20-ounce curved stainless steel tumbler to this bad boy. So, of course, it's covered completely in clay except for that one removed spot, and it is an awesome build. Now, I did bake that, and then we're going to kind of see the end results here. Voila! What an absolute awesome and cute little honey pot. I think once I apply the overall enameled color, and it's going to have an ombre enamel color, and then the bronze or gold rim around the top and the bottom. It's going to have a honeycomb coming out of the side with a realistic honey colored drip. It's going to look really cool, guys. You can kind of see that rib all the way down, it does exist. So it is a textured effect, and I'm going to try to keep that through the entire build so that you feel that through the epoxy. Everything's nice, clean, smooth, no jagged edges. And then, of course, here's where the honeycomb is going to kind of be hanging out of there. It's going to be kind of coming down to the right, and then a small piece to the left just to give it some variation, and then that honey will be dripping down out and around that. And it will also hold that in place. So I'll probably make the honeybees in general just the same overall, and I probably will just place those strategically as I feel the need to. I probably won't want to go over 3 or 4, maybe probably 4 of them. I think four, anything over 4 will be too many. And then the bottom rim, the top rim will be kind of a bronze color as of right now. I think that silver would bring the overall tone of the item up way too much. And I want the overall item to be kind of more of a brown dark tone, and the actual honey emblem will draw the eye. I love the swirl base. It turned out absolutely incredible, and I look forward to using it in other builds. This is an ombre. I think I'm going to do light on top and dark on the bottom, but we'll see. And then video 2 will kind of bring that all together, of course. It'll really start to come alive and pop more than it is now, where it's all white. But man alive, has this thing turned out absolutely incredible. And video number 2 is going to make it pop and come alive even more. I would like to take time to thank you for enjoying the content that I create here on YouTube at Byerly Studios. If you haven't liked this video or subscribed to my channel, please do so. I enjoy making these videos for everybody, and I look forward to bigger and better projects in the future. Definitely check me out on TikTok. I'm still currently on there at Byerly Studios. Later, guys.